Hello and welcome. You're watching To The Point. What message has Pakistan sent to the world by its handling of Zaki-ur-Rahman Rakvi? Is this a critical test of Pakistan's credibility in fighting terror? And will it be of as much concern to the US and UK as it would be to India? That's the key issue in part 2. But first, the revelation that an Indian, Mehdi Masroor Biswas, living in the author of the ISIS-supporting Twitter handle Shami Witness, has raised disturbing questions about the involvement of Indian people with ISIS. How deep and wide could this be? Alongside Al-Qaeda, LET and Jaish, how worrying is the security environment confronting India? Is there a danger that the Bajrang Dal and Dharm Jagran Manch conversions would exacerbate this potential problem? And what does the government need to do about this? Those are the issues I shall discuss in a moment with India's former National Security Advisor and a former head of the Intelligence Bureau, M.K. Narayanan. This is Mr. Narayanan's first interview after demitting office as Governor of Bengal. Mr. Narayanan, let's start with Mehdi Masroor Biswas. How serious and worrying is the discovery that the author of the ISIS-supporting Twitter handle Shami Witness is an Indian living in Bangalore?
Well, I think it confirms a trend which is now evident across the globe, that many educated Muslims are tending towards the ISIS, because ISIS represents spiritual purity in one form and exclusionist puritanism on the other. And I think therefore ISIS is very different from Al-Qaeda, or for that matter many of the previous versions of terrorism or jihadi terrorism that we have seen. To that extent, I would say that the discovery in our midst kind sends shockwaves across India, but quite clearly this is not unusual.
Okay.
For surveys that have been carried out in the West indicate that almost 20 to 27% of young educated Muslims are now veering towards the ISIS in its form of spiritual purity.
I'll come to ISIS and its form of spiritual purity and what sort of appeal that holds out in a moment's time. Let me first focus on Mehdi Masroor Biswas. There are some people who believe that he was purely a propagandist, but today's Hindu newspapers suggest that there are some reasons to also believe that he might have had direct contact with ISIS. He might even have had a role to play in recruitment. Would you accept that those are areas where he could also have been involved?
He could have been involved, but I mean, of course, it's speculation at the moment. But I think his role as propagandist, I think, is as dangerous as the role as recruiter. When you recruit individuals. When you do propaganda, you recruit hundreds or maybe thousands. So I don't think that we need to make much of that kind of differentiation. But I think the fact that you have someone like him carrying on propaganda on the sort of net is, I think, that it should be a cause for concern.
Now, there are some reports that suggest that the National Intelligence Agency was already onto Mehdi Masroor Biswas's trail after being tipped off by Arif Majid, although they didn't know his location and nor did they know his name. But let me ask you bluntly, would we have got to him if Channel 4 hadn't revealed his identity?
You know, I mean, I think that's the first thing that we should learn is that when you're dealing with global terrorism, every single strand that is available to any single group or intelligence agencies or the media, whatnot, requires to be shared. So there's no such thing as first past the post or I got it first, like the media says. This news came first from us. I think it's important for us to understand that to weave the various strands of terrorism, we need collaboration, and I think it's good that Channel 4 was willing to share the information they had with the agencies, both the British and the Indians. And I think this merits a great deal of endorsement and support, rather than to say that, oh, we didn't do it and they got to us first.
Now, the key question, Mr. Narayanan, is how deep and how worrying is the involvement of Indians with ISIS? We know of 4 boys from Kalyan in Maharashtra, and that number includes Arif Majid. We know of 4 or 5 more from Hyderabad who got detained in Calcutta on their way to Baghdad. But is that it? Or could the involvement be far wider and deeper without our as yet knowing fully how wide and deep it is?
I think we're dealing with an entirely different form of jihadi terrorism, if I might use the term. I mean, we have had several variants of global terrorism, and we've all heard of the atavistic worldview of of Abdul Wahab. We have heard of the nihilistic fanaticism of Syed Qutb, and of course combining together with the metasizing of terrorism into a global network, etc. I think that was part of the past or at least till almost the immediate present. And Al-Qaeda was a forerunner and probably the epitome of what it is. We are now coming up against an entirely different form of terrorism. I think the al-Baghdadi sort of ISIS is a threat which is very much more direct as far as India is concerned, far more than to the West. Because I think al-Baghdadi's concept is based on the ancient history of Islam, of seizing territory, holding territory, and global jihad comes later. So they are looking for areas where you have substantial Muslim populations. The idea is to energize and infuse these ideas amongst Muslims, particularly educated Muslims, and make them realize that the caliphate that has been announced is the future. So I think it is in that sense that I see persons like Biswas, Mehdi Biswas and others as far more dangerous than an individual terrorist carrying out a single terrorist act.
Now, speaking at the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London in September, you said that the Indians who'd been attracted to ISIS were mainly engineers. You said they are professionals, they are not the oppressed or the suppressed. Let me ask you, what is it that attracts them to ISIS? You spoke a moment ago of what you call ISIS's strength being its spiritual purity. What precisely do you mean by that?
No, I mean, I think one should, Al-Qaeda and others sort of glorified killings per se for the sake of killings. I think here is a new version which is coming up. The new version, jihad, talks in terms of building a state on the lines of the Abbasid Caliphate of the 8th century. So that is what is attracting the educated youth. They're not interested so much in the killing. If you have to kill, you will kill. But the point really is they want to have a state of their own, a state in which the spiritual Islam would be the dominant sentiment. So that I think is particularly, I think there's been an electrifying impact by talking of the caliphate. It may look far-fetched, it may look, way along down in the future, but I think it has had far greater appeal than many of the other appeals to jihadi violence and jihadi terrorism than in the past. So to that extent, I think ISIS needs an entire new look. You can't deal with ISIS in the manner that we have dealt with either the Lashkar or the Jaish-e-Mohammed or the Al-Qaeda and other forms. I think that is the challenge for us. Can we meet this challenge, which is much more in the minds rather than on the ground? And I think the campaigns in the West of de-radicalization, etc., I think are going nowhere and will go nowhere when faced with this threat.
I want to ask you one or two questions more about the appeal of ISIS before I talk to you about how governments should counter the threat. You said in your lecture to the International Institute of Strategic Studies in London, the new version jihad is proving to be highly attractive. More and more youngsters find this very attractive. What is it about this new version of jihad that appeals particularly to the young?
I think this is the question that I think all, what should I say, strategists are trying to understand. Across the world, whomsoever I've talked to are asking this question. What is it that is making the appeal so great? The nearest I can think of is what I said a few minutes ago, that al-Baghdadi's concept is not of terror per se. He's not merely global jihad per se. He is to have the first state which is, could you call it a terror state if you like, but what is it that we want? To hold territory, we want to keep territory, we want to replicate, as I said, the 8th century Abbasid Caliphate. We want to conquer the world. I mean, this is something fundamentally different from what the Al-Qaeda and other terrorist organizations are. The others were interested in sort of driving, the rest of the world to take various measures. This is putting in place of the flag of the future, so to say. I think it's an appeal to the minds, and that's why the more educated elements are really falling a victim to this kind of propaganda.
Now, you said to the International Institute of Strategic Studies, and I'm quoting you, the figure could be more, but it's clearly not less than 100 to 150 Indians who've gone across to join ISIS. How do you come to that estimation?
I think that was not part of my talk. In the question and answer session, they asked me, what could be numbers? And they said, can it be 10, can it be 15? I said, well, it can be 100, because one does not have a clear idea of the numbers. The point I wish to make is that it's not the numbers who have actually gone to join the ranks, but I would say the resident radicals that we need to be worried about. And I think many of the strategists in the West are looking at this problem, particularly in Europe and in the United Kingdom. Their worry is not even about those who have gone and are likely to come back, but those who are resident. Because as I said, the appeal is to the minds rather than to merely be saying that I've killed so many people, etc. I think that is what we need to, whether the number is 10, 15, 20. We have really no idea. If you go to some of the fishing villages on the west and east coast of India, you will find people talking about X is missing, Y is missing. Have they gone to join the ISIS or have they gone somewhere else? It's not be sure. So the numbers are not so particular to my mind as the fact that you have an idea which is now sweeping across part of the Muslim world. And countries which have sizable Muslim populations are certainly far more vulnerable than perhaps the West is, where the Muslim population is much smaller in number.
Now, as you say, this is an appeal to the mind, and it's an appeal that happens directly through the net, and that's what makes it so... As you said, this is an appeal to the mind, and it's an appeal that happens directly through the net, and that's what makes it so accessible and so immediate. How should the government counter this appeal?
I wish I knew. I'm no longer the National Security Advisor. Even when I was there, I don't think I did too good a job on this. But the fact of the matter is, I think this is something we need to really look at very closely. My own personal view is that we are now dealing with an entirely new kind of threat. And I think many of the methods that we have adopted, I was part of all those methods, are not fully valid to deal with this problem. I think we need far more sort of understanding as to what are the undersprings on which this is based. We need professors, philosophers, and others to look at this problem. We need far more association with people across the globe to see how do we deal with something that appeals to the mind. We can, of course, try to limit the use of the internet, online transmissions, etc., but I think that's a game that you're bound to fail in. We need to tackle how to deal with a problem that is an issue of the mind. To some extent, it's like dealing with what communism was in its heyday. How do you deal with an idea? And I think that is the first thing that we need to understand, and not look at it as purely as the latest variant of an old terrorist syndrome.
In which case, if I understand you correctly, you're saying this is probably one of the biggest security challenges facing the Indian state. And in response, we need to literally think out of the box. We have to be innovative and find new ways of tackling this problem, because the old tried procedures are not going to work.
Yeah, in a sense, for want of anything better to say, that's what I have to say.
Unfortunately, Mr. Narayanan, it's not just ISIS that is luring Indians towards jihad. In September, Al-Qaeda set up a special wing for the subcontinent, and Ayman al-Zawahiri, when he announced it, specifically mentioned by name Assam, Gujarat, Ahmedabad and Kashmir as potential targets. Do you see that as another direct threat to India, or do you agree with many analysts who say this is better understood in the perspective of Al-Qaeda responding somewhat desperately to ISIS, because ISIS is clearly overshadowing and overtaking Al-Qaeda? Which of the two explanations work with you?
Oh, in a sense, I would say neither or both, if you understand what I'm trying to say. I think, what we really are facing is a whole lot of franchises of terrorism. I mean, the Al-Qaeda has so many franchises. The Al-Qaeda in the AQIM, you have the AQIS, you have the AQ, you have the Boko Haram, you have etc., etc., etc. And I think there is no one Al-Qaeda. So the Al-Qaeda in AQIS, the Indian Pakistani model that we are talking of, is probably what I would say revarnishing an old variant that already existed. But I think we have some idea what the Al-Qaeda wishes to do, and I think we are conscious of the fact that we have certain methods and methodologies to deal with it. I think that the Al-Qaeda's appeal is far less to the mind than, I think, to exploit a sense of grievance which is felt across the many minority populations, Muslim minority populations, etc. And hence the references to Gujarat and Assam and whatnot. So that, I believe, is of course a threat. It has been a threat, it will remain a threat till we are able to control it. But in my opinion, the ISIS represents a different kind of threat, a far graver threat. It is a threat that is posed to those elements that we normally see as our allies in the fight against the kind of Al-Qaeda threat that we require. And that is why I felt that we will need to look at a whole new set of policies, programs and actions, and need many more allies both within the country and outside as to how to go about it.
Okay.
But I'm not minimizing the threat posed by the Al-Qaeda. It is serious and we need to be on the guard, but I think to some extent we have the measure of that problem. But I think on the ISIS we are far behind, far lower down the curve.
Now, a third cause of concern are the militant groups, mainly or mostly based in Pakistan, who've been active in Afghanistan but could now turn their attention to India once American and allied troop levels come down to around 12,500 or thereabouts in January. How worried are you about this third cause of problem?
No, it is a very serious problem. I mean, we have always been concerned, I think for several years now, ever since the Americans started talking about winding down their forces and leaving Afghanistan. I think government agencies, security agencies, the cabinet, etc., have discussed this at length. And I think this is a constant source of worry. We have seen what happened after the Americans withdrew in the 1980s from the scene. And what happened, we will see probably a revival of this. The Tehreek-e-Taliban, we've just seen the kind of brutality that they are capable of. And I think what we are going to see would be that while in, let us say, 20th century terrorism was known for its kind of lethal violence, it is a savagery and brutality that is going to be the hallmark in the period ahead. And as Afghanistan sort of buckles under the pressures of various kinds, we will see a far, far more serious threat emanating as far as India is concerned. But in some ways, I know I'm going back and again like a bad penny to the ISIS threat. I think it's possible for us to deal with that threat better than we can possibly deal with the ISIS threat as of now.
Is there a danger, Mr. Narayanan, that ISIS or the new Al-Qaeda, but perhaps more so ISIS, could link up with Lashkar-e-Taiba or the Jaish and create an exceptionally virulent threat for India? Could that sort of link up happen to our detriment?
No, you see, one of our major allies in the battle against, whether it's the Al-Qaeda or the Lashkar is a part of the Al-Qaeda for that matter, and from 1998, sometimes we separate them because we're directly involved with the Lashkar in that sense of the term. The allies were the the more educated Muslims who didn't feel a sense of, what should I say, being crucified for one reason or the other, etc. And therefore, they were the ones that we turned to whenever we had problems. The point is, when if your educated classes, I mean, in this case it happens to be the Muslim youngsters, but if you have similar ideologies elsewhere, then you have nowhere to turn to. The combining is in a sense always likely, because the ISIS also believes in violence. It also sees violence as a means to an end. Whereas in the case of Al-Qaeda, I think to some extent violence was an end in itself. So the two could always merge, which aggravates or exacerbates the extent of the danger or the threat. So in that sense, yes.
Now, in these circumstances, let's come, Mr. Narayanan, to recent events in India and what impact they could have on the potential for terror. There have been a series of communal incidents of varying dimensions in Muzaffarnagar, Trilokpuri in Delhi, Vadodara. There have been accusations of love jihads, conversion campaigns, and a whole set of Hindutva-style statements made by an assortment of BJP MPs, ministers, as well as members of the Sangh Parivar. Taken all together, are you worried that this is creating an environment that could push Muslim boys further into the clutches of radical Muslim voices and thus indoctrinate them, whether those voices come from ISIS or elsewhere?
Oh, I think you're now moving me into realms of policy which I do not wish to get involved in. But, you know, I think communal violence has always been to some extent endemic in certain parts of the country. And I think even when I was the NSA, or even when I was the governor of West Bengal, there are several occasions that I had an opportunity to talk to the Home Minister and the Prime Minister, to talk in terms of what I would call the individual signals that were coming of communal violence. Now, wherever you have communities which are fighting for the same piece of the cake, you have scope for violence. I mean, Western UP is a classic example of pressure groups. You have the Jats, you have the Yadavs, you have the Muslims, and it requires a great deal of dexterity on the part of the authorities, both the central and state authorities, to ensure that this does not lead to conflagration. Because once it starts, it tends to spread. So I don't want to, I think the two are but if there is communal violence, then there's always an opportunity to intensify this by launching militant attacks by individual groups. So in a sense, I don't think the two are quite related. It's useful if leaders will exercise a certain degree of caution in what they say, so that the fault lines that exist in certain parts do not get widened. But I don't see this as a direct incitement to the kind of terrorism that you're talking about.
Let me sum this up by putting one simple question to you. Do you think India's vulnerability to terror, both because of developments in the region around us, as well as because of developments within the country, do you think that vulnerability is increasing, or is it the same?
Yeah, I think the vulnerability as far as the situation of the country is no worse or no better than what we have had in the recent past. But the vulnerability has certainly grown because I think both in our immediate and extended neighborhood, I think the degree of turbulence that is taking place, particularly kind of the terrorist situation that we can see across, and more so with what's happening in West Asia, I think certainly aggravate the climate for violence. And if Afghanistan sort of topples over in that sense, and if Pakistan turns out to be, if not a failed state, a failing state, a state which has a pronounced state weakness, then I think our problem will become far, far greater than what we had in the recent past.
Let's come very briefly to yesterday's news that Zaki-ur-Rahman Lakhvi has been granted bail by the anti-terrorism court in Rawalpindi. The court said, the judge said that bail was being granted because they do not have what they call clinching evidence. They don't have sufficient evidence. You're someone who probably knows better than most people how good or how bad is the nature of the evidence against Lakhvi. Do you believe it's clinching, or do you believe that there is a point when the judge in Rawalpindi says it's not sufficient?
I think I once answered a question of yours, Karan, about the evidence that we had in one of the cases in India, and I said that I think the evidence that is available is the best possible that you could ever get in a terrorist case, and I think it is clinching evidence. I think on the occasion that I talked to you, I was more guarded. I said whether it's clinching or not is for the judge to decide. In this case, I would say there is clinching evidence, but unfortunately the judge seems to have decided otherwise.
Now, this afternoon the Pakistan government has made it public that they will appeal to their Supreme Court against the bail order, and secondly, they will continue to keep in detention Zakir al-Lakhmi for another 3 months because they've arrested him now under the maintenance of public order. Is that in your eyes a sufficient response, or is it an inadequate one from Rawalpindi?
Zakir al-Lakhmi was running many operations from within the precincts of his jail. So whether he is out or not, the Pakistan government gives him all the leeway they need. And since his mentor or his leader, or whatever you like to say, the Lashkar-e-Taiba leader is free to do what he likes, I think a lot of this is a mere smokescreen so that Pakistan can do what it likes. As far as India is concerned, I don't think any Pakistan government is going to curb the opportunities that they feel are available to put India in its place, if I may, within quotes.
Now, given the nature of Pakistan and given the control the army and ISI in Pakistan exercise over the detention of alleged terrorists, could bail have been granted by the anti-terrorism court without some sort of nod of approval from the Pakistan army and the ISI?
I don't know. It's difficult to, for me, who's been known as a pronounced hawk, I don't think anything happens in Pakistan without the Pakistan army being involved in some way or the other. But I may be wrong.
My last question. If at the end of 3 months, the Pakistan Supreme Court upholds the bail, either because the appeal put forward by the government is weak or because some sort of pressure was brought to bear by the ISI and the army, if at the end of the day Lakhvi walks free or out on bail at any rate, what message would Pakistan be sending the world about its commitment to the fight to terror?
I think today the world has few illusions about where Pakistan stands on the terrorist map or the terrorist ladder, so to say. I think they all agree that Pakistan, if not a promoter of terrorism, is certainly someone which aids terrorism against those enemies or against those countries that it views as its enemies. It is a state that has from time to time been exposed for permitting to use its territory to carry out terrorist attacks, whether it's Afghanistan, whether it is into India, and some of its terrorists have also acted against China and other countries. So I don't think there is any doubt in anybody. The only point is Pakistan's location is something that is seen to be of great advantage to many countries, and that's what Pakistan has managed to exploit over the years.
So in a sense, this is a litmus test for Pakistan's credibility, and they could easily fail it if they don't take the right stand on the future of Lakhvi. In a nutshell, that's what you're suggesting, aren't you?
I don't see any possibility of their succeeding. They will fail the litmus test.
All right. Thank you very much for talking to us, Mr. Narayanan. I'm deeply grateful that you made time and deeply grateful that you gave your first interview to us after demitting office as Governor of Bengal.